Hi, it's Jay from Iridescent Tarot back with some more sparkle for you. So today we're really getting in deep with the sparkles because I want to give you the ultimate guide to gilding today. I had a viewer reach out and ask me some really specific questions about comparing the shiny gilding that's on MPC versus something like the matte gilding that's on the Pipspeak Tarot. And that kind of gave me this idea to go through all the different gilding types that I do have in my collection and kind of give you my thoughts and perceptions on them as somebody who finds the tactile experience of shuffling my cards to be extremely important in the reading process. This is a favorite topic of mine, cardstock and gilding. So I think I'm going to make this a part one. And this is kind of like the frosting on the cupcake, right? Like this is the most exciting part to me, the gilding, but I'm also going to make at least a part two just talking about the cardstock. And so that's more of like the cupcake part of the cupcake. You know what I mean? So how I'm going to structure this is I brought out one example of each kind of cardstock that I have in my collection. And I'm going to kind of not rank them, but like I'm going to progress through the different types of cardstock. And the last one is my favorite kind of gilding. Okay. So if you're curious about what that is, stay tuned. So this is the Tarts Tarot. And this has one of the most unique cardstocks in my collection. I only have one other deck that is like this, and it's like super floppy and bendy, and I love it so much. But you'll note that the edges are bare. So neutral edges. So this is your most basic ungilded option. And a lot of times when decks come in and they're ungilded, me personally, and this is different for everyone, so I can only speak to my own experience, but I feel like ungilded edges have like this unfinished feel to them. And a lot of times I prefer to edge them myself, either with sparkly brush pens or glitter markers or something to that effect. I think I've heard other people talk about actually foiling them with like gold leaf. I've never done that. But certain decks I will leave unaltered. And so this is one of the decks that, because I liked the cardstock so much and I didn't want anything to change, I just left it plain. And as I've shuffled, the cardstock, as it rubs against each other, ends up chipping into itself. And what you can see there, it's called floxing, when the edges of the cardstock kind of gets like a little bit fluffy and papery and the fibers separate. And I really like floxing because it makes it feel soft. So when I'm watching TarotTube videos and I see people with these like really old vintage decks that have been, through the ringer, around the block, and, maybe they belong to somebody for the last 40 years and that was their main reader. I love that because the edges are super soft to the touch. So this deck feels super comfortable in my hand. And even though there's no, sparkly, shiny gilding, I like the way that it feels. I'm going to compare that to something like Ethereal Visions, which is a US Games deck. And for some reason, even though this doesn't have gilding, the edges of it feel pretty sharp to me. And because the cards are just a tiny bit oversized, when I reach around them to riffle, like this part cuts into my thumb and this part cuts into my finger. And as I'm pushing the pressure down to riffle, it's kind of rubbing those edges against my fingertips. That creates an experience for me that I do not enjoy. And as you can see, there's no floxing on these cards because I haven't really used them that much because they hurt my fingers. There are decks that have sharp edges. This is another US Games deck that I'm so intent on working with that I take a nail buffer to them and kind of buff down the edges where those sharp edges are. And it kind of simulates the repetitive motion use of shuffle, 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 and gets that floxing process started early. And so even though I haven't worked with Herbcrafters a ton, the edges of this deck feel soft to me because of the work that I've done on them. I also edged this deck in like a clear sparkly marker. You probably can't see it much because it's super, super subtle, but I do find that adding any kind of self-edging to the cards does seem to like soften up the cardstock a little bit. I think it might be because, the cardstock is getting wet because of the marker being rubbed on the edges, and that moisture kind of softens up whatever cardstock, the cardstock there. So in general, I tend to edge a lot of my decks, not just because I love the sparkles, but also because whatever like little bit of texture or gritty feeling is present on the edges of the cards from them being unfinished is kind of neutralized by my edging of the cards. This is the Pressed Flower Tarot, and this is another deck that I edged in sparkly marker, and I love how this came out. It really matches the back swell and just makes it feel finished and complete to me. And most of the time I'm going to end up doing this to my unedged decks. The Oracle of Unknown Reasons is another deck that I am contemplating leaving bare edged because Eco Herbage cardstock is one that fluxes a lot just on its own. Even though I haven't had it that long, just regular use makes the edges a little bit floxed, and I'm totally okay with that. But I think that if I were to edge this in any color, it would probably come off pretty quickly, and I don't necessarily want that. So the only thing that I am thinking about is, again, edging it in that clear sparkle marker just to give it a little bit of glitz, but not something that's going to end up chipping and looking super damaged or discombobulated. Next category is flat matte gilding, and this is the Livett the Ghost Tarot. And this just has plain matte edging that's not shiny in any way. I don't see any sparkle to it, but I did get this secondhand, so who knows? There might have been sparkle when it first arrived. I don't know, but right now it's matte. It doesn't have any sparkle or shine, and I think some people call these sprayed edges. Sprayed edges aren't my preference because to me, the dry feeling of this matte edge gives me like a nails on a chalkboard type feeling. And I've noticed that this flat matte gilding tends to chip quite a bit. Not on this deck specifically, just other decks that I've had in the past. So my preference is not for these flat matte edges. Next up, we have sparkly matte edges, and this is the Pipspeak Tarot. As you can see, the gilding on this is still shiny, like it reflects the light, but it doesn't have that same reflective quality that super shiny gilding has. And throughout the many decks that I've had, I've never had a shiny, sprayed, matte, sparkly gilding that was also sharp. It's not to say that it doesn't exist, but I personally have never felt one. Next up, we have Tarot Monet Ami. This is my Impressionist curated art deck that I'm working on getting printed, but I did order my very first prototype from MPC. So this is on their linen cardstock with shiny gilding. MPC doesn't have the matte gilding option, so if you're ordering off of there, you're gonna get this similar type of gilding. This is super shiny. You can see it reflective in the light. It's mirror finish, and I don't have any issues or complaints with it being sharp. I don't know if it's partly to do with the fact that most of their cardstock is pretty thin and flexible, so the resistance isn't there that like pushes my finger into the edge of the card to make it feel sharp. But I've had many different decks from MPC that have this gilding on it, whether it's on the linen cardstock, standard smooth, or superior smooth, whatever one, and none of them have felt sharp to me. I will say though that this is all a very personal experience, and that what feels good to me in my hands might not feel good to somebody else. And as I went through my collection to choose decks for this response, I realized none of the truly like sharply gilded decks have ever stayed for very long in my collection. Like if they are a very unpleasant tactile experience, typically that deck leaves my collection. And so I love the cardstock and the edging from MPC. So for me, there's no complaints with this. There is one other kind of shiny gilding that I've seen, and this is one of the only decks that I've ever seen have this edging. This is Wisdom of Pooh Tarot. So as you can see, it still has that reflective quality that the shiny gilding has, but it's just toned down a little bit. It's like a combination between matte and shiny gilding, and this is one of the only decks that I've ever seen that has this. I really struggled to find any shiny gilding that had sharp edges still left in my collection. I think the closest one might be this Dirt Gems Indie Edition. But even so, it's not super sharp. Like if I riffle it, I can definitely notice the gilding. I have like a little bit of drag sensation against the gilding as I shuffle. But even so, it's not the worst. It's not the worst. And I think that for the most part, in general, I find that indie decks have less of the issue of the super sharp, shiny gilding. And we see that mostly with gilding on mass market decks. Specifically, you see people talk about them having a lip where it's almost like somehow the gilding seems to push the edges of the card away from each other. They like roll up, or there's like this overhang where the gilding is like, you know, dried and it's still like minuscule amount that exists that's not on the card. That's where you have that lip or that really sharp gilding. And I went through my collection a few times to see if I had any like that, and I don't, but I definitely have felt them. So I know that whichever ones had that, I've moved on. And my number one favorite gilding is isn't any surprise, Playful Heart Tarot. And that would be because it has holographic gilding. Just look at it. Beautiful. It has that same soft feeling to it where if I run my fingers over it, I don't really feel it. It just feels like slippy and slidey. And then as I riffle and push the cards, I don't notice it. And I think that's what the conclusion is that I don't want to notice the gilding. I want it to just be seamless with my shuffling process. I did my best to pick these up in a way that you could see the differences, but we have Pip Speak and then Wisdom of the Pooh in the center and then Tarot Monet and me on the end here. And we've got our matte sparkly gilding, the half matte, half shiny in the middle, and then the super shiny gold gilding on the end. All three of these options to me are soft on the hands and don't impede my shuffling. They all have a pleasant shuffling experience in my opinion. So at least for me, I can confidently say that the gilding plays a huge role in my ability to read with and appreciate a deck because it's such a tactile experience, and you can seemingly get sharp or soft gilding on any kind. You might have ungilded that's sharp or soft. You might have fully gilded that's sharp or soft. Like I said, the only one that I haven't felt be sharp in my 10 years of reading with and collecting decks has been the matte sprayed edges. But you know, it has its trade-off. The trade-off is it's not as smooth and like glidey on my fingertips as something that's like super shiny like this. Like this just feels nicer for me to run my fingers across. It's got like a cooling sensation versus this feels like there's a little bit more drag because it's closer to an unfinished texture. So I hope that answered your question and was helpful. I'm really excited to film another part to this and talk about the cardstock itself and my copious thoughts, feelings, and preferences about those, because I do really have strong opinions about cardstock. And because tarot is a tool that's meant to be physically handled and used, I don't think we can understate the importance of having the tool feel good in the hand. And the way that the cardstock and the gilding meet together really seems to have an impact. If there's any kind of gilding that you've seen that I haven't mentioned or anything else, please share it down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, all the things, and I will talk to you later. Signing out.